It was the kind of house you would avoid if you had any sense. The house on Willow Lane had been abandoned for years, left to decay as the neighborhood around it grew quieter and emptier. The stories about it were always whispered in low voices. Some said a terrible tragedy happened inside. Others claimed to have seen figures in the windows late at night. But no one dared to go near it. That was until the Johnson family moved in. The Johnsons were a quiet, normal family. Mark and Lisa, along with their 2 children, 10-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Ben, had been looking for a new start after some tough financial times. When they found the house on Willow Lane, it seemed too good to be true. A big, old house at such a low price. It was like a dream come true. The peeling paint and overgrown garden didn't bother them. They would fix it up, make it a home again. What they didn't know was that the house had other plans. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt wrong. It wasn't something they could explain, but it was there. The house seemed to hold its breath, like it was waiting for something or someone. Lisa felt it first. As she stood in the entryway, looking up at the grand staircase, she shivered, even though it wasn't cold. Mark, always practical, shrugged it off. "It's just an old house, Lisa. A little creepy, sure, but it's nothing." They spent the next few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and trying to ignore the strange creaks and groans that echoed through the halls at night. Emily and Ben didn't seem to notice anything unusual, at least not at first. But soon, Emily started waking up in the middle of the night, hearing strange noises. Footsteps, whispers. She would tiptoe into her parents' room, eyes wide with fear. "I heard someone outside my door, Mom," she would say, her voice trembling. Lisa would reassure her, tuck her back into bed, and tell her it was just her imagination. But as the days passed, even Lisa started to notice the small things, doors that would be open one minute and closed the next, lights flickering for no reason, cold spots in certain parts of the house. She kept telling herself it was nothing, just the house settling, just old wiring. But deep down, she knew something was off. Then came the night everything changed. It started with a knock, a slow, deliberate knock on the front door, even though it was past midnight. Mark, groggy and annoyed, stumbled out of bed to check. He peered through the peephole, but there was no one there, just the empty street, lit by the pale glow of the street lamp. He shook his head, assuming it must have been the wind, and went back to bed. But the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he flung open the door, determined to catch whoever was playing this prank. But again, no one was there. He stepped outside, looking up and down the street. Nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown trees that lined the yard. Frustrated, he slammed the door shut, bolted it, and went back upstairs. As he lay down beside Lisa, the room suddenly felt colder. Much colder. They both sat up, looking around. And that's when they heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps above them. Slow, steady, pacing back and forth in the attic. But the attic was empty. Mark grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table, his hand shaking as he flicked it on. "Stay here," he whispered to Lisa, though he didn't sound as confident as he wanted to. Lisa wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to stay, but fear had gripped her throat too tightly. She nodded and watched as he crept out of the room, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls as he made his way toward the attic stairs. The footsteps continued, growing louder as Mark reached the attic door. With a deep breath, he reached for the handle, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led into the dark, musty space above. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the smell made Mark gag. As he climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mark's heart raced as he shone the flashlight around the attic. Boxes, old furniture, cobwebs, but no one was there. He was about to turn around and leave when something caught his eye, something moving in the corner of the room. A figure, standing in the shadows, just watching him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly stepped forward into the light. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and hollow. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream as she reached out toward him. Mark stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the stairs. He tumbled down, crashing onto the floor below. His head hit the ground hard, and everything went black. When he woke up, he was back in bed, Lisa hovering over him with a worried expression. "You were sleepwalking," she said, her voice trembling. "I found you at the bottom of the stairs." But Mark knew the truth. He hadn't been sleepwalking. There was something in the house, something watching them, and it wasn't going to leave. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences only grew worse. The air inside the house felt heavier, like something was pressing down on them, suffocating them. The once inviting rooms now felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. Even the children, who had once been excited about their new home, seemed different. They were quieter, withdrawn. Emily refused to sleep in her room anymore. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming about the woman in the corner. Emily's screams pierced the night like a knife. She would wake up drenched in sweat, trembling uncontrollably, insisting that a woman stood in the corner of her room, just staring at her. Lisa would rush in, trying to calm her down, but each night it became harder to convince Emily that it was just a nightmare. The fear in her daughter's eyes told Lisa otherwise. There was something very wrong with this house. Ben, too, had changed, normally energetic and playful. He now spent most of his time sitting quietly by the window, staring out into the backyard. When Lisa asked him what he was looking at, he would only respond with a soft, "She's watching us, Mommy." "Who's watching us?" Lisa asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Ben's gaze didn't waver from the window. The lady in the garden. Lisa's blood ran cold. She turned to look out the window, but there was no one there. Just the overgrown grass and the thick trees swaying in the wind. She forced a smile and ruffled Ben's hair. "There's no one there, sweetie. It's just your imagination." But Ben didn't seem convinced. He continued to sit by the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. Lisa felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She had tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that the house was just old and creaky, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen, lurking in the shadows. Mark, on the other hand, refused to believe there was anything supernatural going on. "This is ridiculous, Lisa," he said one evening after Emily had woken up screaming yet again. "You're letting the kids' fears get to you. It's an old house. It's bound to make noises." But Lisa knew it was more than just noises. She had started noticing things too. Dark shapes moving just out of the corner of her eye, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off their fear. One evening, as Lisa was folding laundry in the bedroom, she heard a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was coming from the hallway. She froze, her heart racing. Slowly, she stepped out of the bedroom and into the dark hallway, her breath catching in her throat. The whispering continued, but she couldn't understand what it was saying. It was like a low, hissing voice, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The air in the hallway was icy cold, and Lisa's skin prickled with fear. She turned to look down the hall and gasped. Standing at the far end, just beyond the light's reach, was a shadowy figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a face shrouded in darkness. Lisa's knees went weak, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her with those empty, hollow eyes. Lisa stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly faded into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Shaking, Lisa rushed back into the bedroom and slammed the door behind her. She collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling uncontrollably. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Lisa tried to tell Mark what had happened, but he brushed it off as just her imagination. "You've been under a lot of stress," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You're just seeing things." But Lisa knew what she had seen, and she knew it wasn't her imagination. As the days passed, the house grew darker. The once bright, sunlit rooms now seemed to be swallowed by shadows. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and it was becoming harder to breathe. Even Mark, who had been so skeptical at first, began to notice the changes. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, all they could hear was the sound of their own breathing. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the halls. Mark jumped up, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer. "Stay here," he whispered to Lisa and the kids, his voice tight with fear. He flicked on the flashlight and headed toward the sound of the footsteps. Lisa clutched Emily and Ben tightly to her side, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then suddenly stopped. There was a long, heavy silence. Lisa held her breath, waiting, listening. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out. The room was plunged into complete darkness. Lisa's heart pounded in her ears as she strained to hear any sound, any movement. Suddenly, the door to the living room creaked open. Lisa gasped, her grip tightening on the children. A cold draft swept through the room, and in the doorway stood a figure, a tall, shadowy figure, just like the one she had seen in the hallway. It stood there, watching them, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Lisa screamed. The figure stepped forward, its long, spindly limbs reaching out toward them. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Lisa backed up against the wall, her heart racing. The figure moved closer and closer, its eyes fixed on them, unblinking. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. The air was thick with an eerie silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath. But Lisa knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. After that night, nothing was the same. Every corner of the house seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy, and no one could escape its grip. The Johnsons felt it most at night. The creaking of floorboards, the soft whispers that echoed through the walls, the constant sensation that someone or something was always watching. Lisa became a shell of her former self, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure, its empty eyes staring into her soul. Mark tried to remain rational, but even he couldn't deny the growing terror that had taken hold of their home. The children were the most affected. Emily's night terrors had grown worse. She would wake up screaming, her small body trembling with fear. "The lady is here," she would cry, pointing to the corner of her room. "She's watching me." Ben, too, had become more withdrawn. He stopped speaking altogether, his eyes always fixed on something only he could see. Lisa found him one night, sitting at the foot of his bed, his face pale and his eyes wide. When she asked him what was wrong, he whispered, "She's in the walls." The terror was no longer confined to the night. The terror had seeped into every part of their lives. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, creaking and groaning as if the house was breathing. Lisa noticed subtle but horrifying changes. The doors would open and close on their own, the lights flickered constantly, and the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms. Worst of all was the feeling of being watched, a cold, invasive gaze that never left them. Mark tried to keep things together. He spent hours researching old house stories, trying to find logical explanations. "It's probably just the wind," he would say, but even his voice was starting to crack under the pressure. He began avoiding certain parts of the house, and his once skeptical mind was now filled with fear he couldn't explain. The children were slipping away from them. Emily no longer played with her toys, and Ben had become eerily silent. He barely ate, barely spoke, and Lisa caught him standing at the basement door more than once, staring at it with a blank expression. When she asked him why, his response sent chills down her spine. "She calls me," he said in a whisper, his voice void of any emotion. "From the basement. She wants me to come." Lisa grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the door. "Don't ever go down there, Ben," she said firmly, her voice trembling. But deep down, she knew it wasn't enough to stop whatever was happening. The house had already sunk its claws into them. That night, they all huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep in their own rooms. Lisa and Mark kept the lights on, but even the light didn't offer the protection they had hoped for. The shadows still danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed to move on their own. Every noise, every creak, every whisper felt like a threat. Then, around midnight, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was their shallow, panicked breathing. Lisa reached for Mark's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The children were silent, their wide eyes barely visible in the dim glow of the moonlight, streaming through the window. Suddenly, there was a soft creaking sound coming from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. Mark grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. He pointed it towards the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor stretching out into the darkness. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside the living room door. Lisa clutched Emily and Ben to her chest, her pulse racing. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then the door creaked open. The room fell silent, and for a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. The air was thick, suffocating, and a cold draft swept through the room, making the hair on the back of Lisa's neck stand up. In the doorway stood a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a solid, towering figure. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. It radiated an icy cold that made the room feel like a frozen tomb. The figure took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned under its weight. Lisa screamed. The figure seemed to glide across the room, its movements slow and deliberate. It reached out a long, spindly arm, its fingers like claws, reaching for them. Lisa backed up against the wall, her heart pounding in her ears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Mark lunged forward with the flashlight, swinging it wildly at the figure. But it passed right through the entity as if it were made of smoke. The figure didn't stop. It kept moving towards them, relentless, unstoppable. "Get out!" Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But the figure didn't listen. It loomed over them, its presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. Just as the figure reached out to touch them, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. Lisa collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with fear. Mark sat beside her, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. The children were silent, their small bodies trembling as they clung to their parents. But the terror wasn't over. They could still feel it, the presence, the cold, the watching eyes. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. That night marked the beginning of their descent into madness. Lisa and Mark tried everything, burning sage, calling in priests, even attempting to move out, but nothing worked. The house had claimed them, and it wasn't going to release its grip. The shadows grew darker, the whispers louder, and the figure became more frequent. It would appear at random times, at night, in the morning, even in broad daylight, always watching, always waiting. And each time, it came closer, lingering a little longer, its cold, empty eyes locked on them. Emily's nightmares worsened. She began speaking in her sleep, saying things that sent shivers down Lisa's spine. "She's here," Emily would whisper. "She's in the walls. She's coming for us." Ben stopped speaking altogether. He no longer responded to his parents, no longer smiled, no longer laughed. It was as if the house had drained the life out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of the boy he once was. Lisa and Mark were trapped in a house that was slowly driving them mad, a house that seemed to feed off their fear. They couldn't leave, couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let them. And then one fateful night, it all came to a head. It was a stormy night, the wind howling outside and the rain beating against the windows. Lisa was sitting in the living room, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the door. Mark was upstairs, trying to put the kids to bed, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Something was going to happen. She could feel it. Suddenly, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the familiar cold crept in, wrapping around her like icy fingers. The air in the house had grown thick with dread. Lisa could barely breathe as the darkness consumed the room. The cold wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something more sinister, like a presence wrapping its fingers around her throat. She sat frozen, heart pounding, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, as if it was alive, feeding on their terror. Upstairs, she heard Mark's voice calling for her, but it was faint, like it was coming from far away. Lisa. Lisa. His voice was weak, almost drowned by the howling wind outside. And then it stopped. Silence. Lisa's blood ran cold. Something wasn't right. She stood up, every muscle in her body tense, and grabbed the flashlight that was lying on the table. The beam was weak, flickering in and out, barely cutting through the thick darkness that filled the house. As she moved towards the stairs, she heard it a soft, dragging sound. It was coming from above, slow and deliberate. She froze. The sound was heavy, like something being pulled across the floor. Her mind raced. Was it Mark? The kids? Or something else? "Mark," she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. No response, just that awful dragging sound, growing closer. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. With each step, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just dragging anymore. There was a wet, sloshing sound, like something being torn apart. As she reached the top of the stairs, the flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, she saw it, a figure at the end of the hallway. It was tall, its body twisted and wrong, like something out of a nightmare. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with a malevolent light, staring right at her. In its arms, it held something limp, something bloody. Lisa's heart stopped. It was Mark. His body hung lifeless in the creature's grasp, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Blood dripped from his neck, pooling on the floor beneath him. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl, and dropped Mark's body with a sickening thud. Lisa screamed. She turned and ran, her legs shaking, barely able to carry her down the stairs. Her mind was in a frenzy, unable to process what she had just seen. But there was no time to think, no time to grieve. She had to get to the kids. She had to get out of the house. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in the doorway to the living room was Ben. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something wrong about him. His expression was blank, emotionless, like he wasn't really there. "Ben, baby, we have to go," Lisa said, her voice trembling. But Ben didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her with those empty eyes. "She told me," he whispered, his voice hollow. "She told me we can't leave." Lisa's heart sank. She took a step toward him, but before she could reach him, the basement door behind him creaked open. A cold draft rushed out, and from the darkness, the figure emerged. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, brushing against Ben's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't even react. He just stood there, as if he was under the creature's control. Lisa screamed again, but this time, the sound seemed to die in her throat. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by her fear, and then it reached for her. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted for the front door. She could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps slow and deliberate, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn it. But just as she got it open, a cold hand grabbed her shoulder. She spun around, but it wasn't the creature. It was Emily. Her daughter stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's in me." Before Lisa could react, Emily collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing violently. Lisa dropped to her knees, cradling her daughter's small, fragile body in her arms, tears streaming down her face. But it was too late. Emily's eyes rolled back into her head, and with one final, shuddering breath, she went still. Lisa screamed, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She rocked back and forth, holding Emily's lifeless body. As the darkness closed in around her, the figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. It stood over her, watching, waiting. There was no escape. The house had claimed them. One by one, it had taken everything from her. And now, it was her turn. With a final, desperate cry, Lisa looked up at the creature. Its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light. And then it reached down, its long fingers wrapping around her throat. The last thing she saw was its twisted, horrifying face, grinning down at her as the world went dark. The house, old and forgotten, stood as it always had, looming and silent, a sentinel of darkness at the edge of town. The wind howled through its cracked windows, carrying with it whispers of what had transpired inside. No one dared come near it anymore. It had been weeks since anyone had seen Lisa, Mark, Ben, or Emily. The police had conducted their search, knocking on every door in town, combing the woods and questioning neighbors, but there were no leads. The family had vanished without a trace. The only thing they found was an empty, abandoned house with all the belongings left untouched. It was as if the family had simply been swallowed by the shadows. The case was soon closed, filed away under unsolved mysteries. But the town folk knew better. They had heard the stories about the house for generations, stories of those who entered but never left, whispers of malevolent spirits, ancient curses, and things far worse than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just a haunted house. It was a trap, feeding on the lives of those foolish enough to step inside. In the months that followed, the rumors grew stronger. Some said they could hear faint screams in the dead of night, coming from deep within the walls. Others swore they saw shadows moving behind the windows, even though the house had been abandoned for years. But no one dared go inside, not after what happened to the last family. The town's children would often dare each other to get close, taunting and teasing, but no one ever crossed the threshold. The house had claimed enough lives, and the darkness inside it was never satisfied. One rainy evening, a stranger came into town. He was tall, his face obscured by the hood of his coat. He walked slowly, deliberately, and didn't speak a word to anyone. The locals watched him from their windows as he made his way up the hill toward the old house. "Don't go there," a man called from his porch, but the stranger didn't stop. He walked on, disappearing into the mist as the night swallowed him whole. The townspeople waited, holding their breath, wondering if they'd ever see him again. But they knew the answer. Anyone who entered the house never returned. The next morning, the house stood as it always had, dark and silent. No one knew what had happened to the stranger, but they didn't need to ask. The house had claimed him too. And so, the legend continued. The house remained, a looming monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. It stood as a reminder of the evil that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, and always hungry. In time, the town moved on, but the house remained. Forever silent, forever watching, and forever cursed. And it will continue to stand, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to cross its threshold. waiting for its next victim. Because in the end, the house always wins.